Okay, and this is part 3 of the chapter 10 lecture, and this part will talk about temperament. So, temperament is another word of saying what we typically describe as personality. So, it's what we consider the affective or the emotional core of personality. Um, we can't measure personality in infancy the way we can in later childhood and adolescence and adulthood. And so we use temperament as a proxy for describing personality in infancy. Temperament has a very clear and inherited basis. There are similarities in temperament from babies to parents to grandparents, suggesting that there's a high heritability. And temperament is typically present and observable either at birth or shortly after birth and is pretty consistent and relatively stable across time. And there are three types of temperament that we typically categorize babies into. Easy, this should say easy, not east, difficult, and slow to warm up. Easy babies typically make up about 40% of babies examined. These babies have regular patterns of eating and sleeping. In general, when they're not hungry or tired, they have a general positive mood. They're eager to approach people and objects. They smile a lot. They react to events with low to moderate levels of intensity. They're not overly intense or extreme in any way. Difficult babies make up about 10%. This is an old image that I apparently need to change out. I usually like to update it to the current president, but I forgot, to be honest. And so difficult babies have unpredictable eating and sleeping patterns and habits. They typically sleep very little and therefore have negative moods. Even when they're not hungry or tired, they exhibit negative moods. They typically have difficulty adjusting to new environments or new stimuli, and they react to events with really high levels of intensity. And then finally, we have a slow to warm up. So slow to warm up, it's not that these babies are difficult, they just take a little time in order to become easy. So this is what we call a slow pattern of reaction. They have a tendency to withdraw in novel situations, and then once they feel comfortable, they reemerge. And they tend to have low activity and low intensity in terms of their reactions and behaviors. Now, in general, easy babies typically have better outcomes in childhood, better school performance, better relationships with peers, better relationship with teachers and adults, etc. However, much like everything else that we've talked about all semester, this interacts with environment. Easy babies in bad environments can have bad outcomes. And difficult and slow to warm up babies in good environments can have really positive outcomes. So it's not that being an easy baby is just better, because if an easy baby is in a bad environment, then being easy doesn't actually provide them with those benefits. And so this is what we call reactivity. So how reactive babies can be. And we can kind of divide babies, instead of on temperament, on their reactivity. So highly reactive babies have really high intensity reactions. They tend to exhibit vigorous distress responses when they're uncomfortable. And then they tend to exhibit shy, timid, and fearful behaviors in the second year. Whereas low reactive infants have low levels of activity and irritability, and they're much more sociable at 2 years. And so high reactivity can be both good and bad. So we call this biological sensitivity to context, or the BSC model. Essentially, this states that there's a genetic disposition that interacts with early environment, and that predicts an outcome. So high reactive children, children that are very reactive, that are very sensitive to the environment, they have high sensitivity to context, okay? These high reactive children, supportive environments are really, really, really good. But unsupportive, difficult, or bad environments are really, really, really bad. And low reactive children seem not to necessarily differ between these bad environments and good environments. So, for example, in this example, you have a low stress environment. I'm going to put my laser pointer. You have a low stress environment here, you have a high stress environment here. And this green line is low reactivity. These are children that don't have high reactivity behaviors. And so in a low stress environment, they tend to be moderately, have an okay outcome. This case is incidence of injury, but you can replace this with depression. You can replace this with externalizing behavior, whatever outcome. And so they actually have higher incidence of injury in this example than a high reactive. So in a really good environment, a high reactive, this orange line, a child actually has a better outcome because they have lower rates of incidence of injury. And in a high stress environment, however, the low reactive children don't change that much, right? In a really bad environment, it may increase from 4 to 5, but there really isn't drastic of a change. But the high reactive children, from a low stress, you have an incidence of 1 injury. In a high stress environment, it's an incidence of 10, right? And so in a good environment, in a low stress environment and really good, they have really good outcomes. And in a high stress environment, they have really bad outcomes. We can categorize these as orchids and dandelions, which is much easier to think about than high reactive and low reactive. So an orchid is a high reactive child. An orchid is, if you've ever tried to keep an orchid alive or grow an orchid, it is very difficult. Orchids require very specific environments, the best of environments to thrive. And so if you put an orchid in a situation where it's not a good environment, they just don't do well at all. And so high reactive children are called orchids because they are very sensitive to the environment. In poor conditions, they fail. In good conditions, they flourish. And so orchid children develop differently based on different environments. On the other hand, we have the dandelions. Dandelions, if you ever tried to kill a dandelion, good luck, right? Dandelions are weeds. They grow in every situation and they grow about the same, right? A dandelion will be the same flower whether it grows in your sidewalk or in a garden. It doesn't matter if the soil is, sour or if it's, ripe. The dandelion will grow. It'll find a way. So a dandelion is a low reactive child. It develops similarly even in very different environments, even if the environment is not good or bad. It doesn't matter. They have very similar outcomes. Okay. When we talk about personality past temperament, we have the 5-factor model. This is the most typical personality model that we have. There are newer ones, which is a topic for a different class, but we're going to talk about the 5-factor model, or OCEAN. O stands for openness to experience, which is essentially how curious, creative, or aesthetically sensitive somebody is. Consciousness or conscientiousness, sorry, not consciousness, conscientiousness is how diligent, planful, or focused somebody is. Extroversion is how cheerful, energetic, or outgoing somebody is. Agreeableness is how cooperative, empathic, polite, kind somebody is. And neuroticism is how afraid, fearful, touchy, or neurotic somebody is. And personality seems to be, much like temperament, this relatively stable reaction to stimuli over time. which at first seems incompatible with development. But in reality, um, it even though it does develop over time, the stability varies across children. So some children have high relationships. This is a correlation. So a high relationship between how they react to different situations. So here you have one child that was approached at time one and time two, and they reacted the same in terms of verbal aggression. They were teased time one, time two. They had similar reactions. Same for praised, warned, punished, right? They have very similar reactions at every time point between time one and time two. And then here you have this child that actually varies differently. So they reacted similarly when they were approached and when they were teased, but when they were praised, one time they had very high verbal aggression, and one time when they were praised, they had low verbal aggression. And same when they were punished, one time they had high verbal aggression, the other time they had low. And so this child, for example, had a correlation between their two time points as a 0.49, which is significantly lower than a correlation of 0.89. And so, even though personality seems to be stable across time, there are individual differences between people. Now, what impacts personality? Truth is that age, gender, parents, social status, and culture all have an impact on personality in childhood. In one study, they tested 205 children in a longitudinal study, and they found significant but low correlations between childhood personality and adult outcomes. Specifically, two parts of personality that seem to be very predictive were conscientiousness and agreeableness, which are related to academic measures. Again, a low but reliable um, correlation, and rule abiding. Also, these were predictive of juvenile delinquency. So, for example, here we have delinquency among 12 to 13-year-old boys, depending on their personality scores early on in childhood. And you can see that the orange are delinquents and green are non-delinquents. And so delinquents tend to be high in extroversion, low on agreeableness, low on conscientiousness, moderate on neuroticism, and low on openness to experience. And children that were non-delinquents were low on extroversion, high in agreeableness, high on conscientiousness, moderate on neuroticism, and high on openness. And so we can use these to potentially predict who might have a problem with emotional regulation and potentially help those children essentially steer a different path. Risk taking in general seems to be higher in boys and men than in girls and women. There's some evolutionary theories about this, essentially that evolutionary competition has made men more likely to risk take because they needed to gain resources in order to gain females. And risk taking, of course, is highest in adolescence, while we can think of risk taking in adolescence as bad, right? Drinking, underage drinking, driving fast. These are risk taking behaviors. It may have a purpose. So think about risk taking in adolescence. Adolescents are trying to become adults and they're trying to separate from parents. So that's automatically they're trying to do things that they weren't allowed to do because that way they can separate themselves from their parents' quote unquote rule, right? But they're also trying to begin competing with their peers. And so being able to have a car or being able to drive fast or being able to do something that other people can't do gives you a competitive edge, right? And they're trying to explore their own social niche. They're trying to see who they are. And one way of doing that is by pushing the boundaries of what they've always done. Of course, peer pressure does contribute. Having friends who engage in risky behaviors increases the likelihood of you engaging in risky behaviors. But of course, much like everything else, genetics is part of this. There's a particular allele of a particular serotonin regulation gene that's associated with greater risk taking in boys. And if they don't have that particular allele of that particular serotonin regulation gene, they're less likely to engage in risk taking. But peer presence in general seems to have this really high impact, particularly in adolescence. So, for example, here is the number of crashes when an adolescent, a young adult, or an adult are either alone or with friends. And if they're alone, the crashes don't seem to differ between these age groups, but spike when they're with friends for adolescents and a little bit for young adults. So for adolescents, the car crashes jumps from 1 to 3, and doubles for young adults, but doesn't necessarily increase for adults. Um, and uh, the more people that are in the car, the greater the chances are of crashes occurring and those crashes leading to deaths. So in this one, you see alone is the red bar. Having one passenger is green, two passengers orange, and three passengers is purple. And you can see that for 16 and 17-year-olds, having two or three passengers increases the chances of a crash occurring and the death of somebody in that crash, whereas there's no significant difference between being alone or being with other passengers for 30 to 59-year-olds. And that's all we got. I cut a lot of material just because I wanted to make this short and sweet. It's our last week of instruction. Please let me know if you have any questions.